Good morning, everyone. I'm Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here today for the launch of Dr. Agnia Grigas' new book, The New Geopolitics of Natural Gas. I want to welcome everyone who's joining this in person, but also via our webcast, and ask that you all join in the conversation on Twitter, sending along questions, comments using the hashtag AC Eurasia, Atlantic Council Eurasia. So the launch of Dr. Grigas' latest book sheds light, I hope, on what the Atlantic Council does best, utilizing our talented senior fellows, their expertise, measured analysis, to gain insight into changing spheres, actors, and as a result, better understand the changing international order. The new geopolitics of natural gas is key to understanding the gas triangle between Europe, Russia, and the United States. Via the lens of natural gas, Dr. Grigas creates a masterful analysis of the changing nature of U.S. technology. By 2020, the U.S. will become the world's third largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, and the increase in dominance of gas markets will challenge and counter Russia's gas influence over Europe with profound implications. Dr. Grigas characterizes this period in U.S. history as a golden age of natural gas. She attributes changing geopolitics around the globe to the American shale boom and a newly globalized market. Her book details the major gas players, the infrastructure, the geopolitical tensions over energy supplies. She vividly illustrates how Russia uses Gazprom as a political tool against Europe and its neighbors in Eurasia. Dr. Grigas is one of the Eurasia Center and the Atlantic Council's star senior fellows, an expert on energy markets, whose work is not only timely but also pertinent to understanding the actors and outlook on an ever-changing energy future. Over the past 4 years, Dr. Grigas has authored 3 books. She's been prolific on this. Aside from the new geopolitics of gas at Harvard University Press, she's authored Beyond Crimea, the New Russian Empire with Yale University Press, and The Politics of Energy and Memory Between the Baltic States and Russia. Via the lens of gas, her work sheds light onto energy issues and development, which are of crucial importance from a transatlantic and global perspective. She has more than a decade of experience as an advisor to corporations and government institutions. Previously, she served as an advisor on energy security and the economy for the Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs, focusing on regional gas diversification solutions and direct foreign investment. In fact, she's walked the walk, working in Vilnius on the issue of how to get LNG into that country. And just last month, Lithuania received its first shipment of American LNG. She's actually not just written and talked about it, she's done it. So among her various achievements, she's an official contributor at The Hill and a frequent commentator and publisher in American media. So with that, I want to turn the podium over to you, Agnia, for your remarks on your book, and we look forward to the conversation that will follow.
Well, first, I really wanted to thank you for coming out this morning and joining me for my book launch and my book talk. It's really a pleasure. And I wanted to let you know a little bit how the idea for this book came about, because really this has been a very long journey and a long process for me. I started in 2014 when it was already evident that we were on the cusp of some very significant changes in the energy markets. Already terms like the golden age of gas were being discussed. The US shale revolution was underway. And at the time, I thought there still wasn't sufficient understanding and maybe analysis of what this is going to mean really for politics, for geopolitics, for American foreign policy, for the major gas importers in Europe, and for significant traditional gas exporters like Russia, countries in the Middle East, Australia, and so on. And also at that time, in 2014, we have to remember there was still a lot of skepticism and still a lot of questions. Will this really come through? Will the US shale revolution last? Can low energy prices really negatively impact it? And there was still really also a lot of questions whether American LNG will really be competitive in the global markets, and particularly in Europe. And I have to say today, I'm very pleased that the initial ideas and optimism that I had with this book really have been met in full. I mean, I think our greatest expectations have been exceeded. And so let's look at what we have today. I mean, what we have now in 2017. And let's make no mistake about it. The United States is now an energy superpower. It is now the largest natural gas producer in the world. It surpassed Russia in 2011. As Damon also mentioned, it is poised to become the third largest LNG exporter by 2020. It is also, if you look at the oil markets, it is a rising, one of the leading producers of oil, rivaling Saudi Arabia, and the leading producer of petroleum products. And we also have a new administration, one that is very eager to really leverage this American energy prowess. We have, I think, what are the origins of Trump's natural gas diplomacy. I've written about this last week in Reuters. And actually, I discussed this type of natural gas diplomacy strategy just last spring at the Atlantic Council with my report. We also have Rick Perry, who has essentially called for a strategy of energy dominance. Again, this is a strategy not only just about economics and dominance in the energy markets, but also about influence and leverage politically that can award the United States. And of course, probably most importantly, we have proof now of over a year of American LNG exports really going across the globe, going to Latin America, going to Asia, going to Europe. I mean, many debated whether American LNG can actually go to Europe. And in 2016, it went to Spain and Portugal and the UK. And many still thought, well, maybe this is pretty much where American LNG will be competitive. But of course, just this summer, we've had tremendous changes with American LNG going to Poland and to Lithuania. So why does all of this matter? And this matters much more than just for the changes in the gas markets. And this is not solely or primarily about the US economy or even American energy security. It really changes the balance of power in the world, and it changes particularly the balance of power in Eurasia. And if we look at a kind of a historical comparison, if we look back now to the early 20th century, we see how the United States emerged as an oil superpower. And it was that American oil production at the start of the 20th century that really helped win World War I and World War II for America and its allies. And that also established America as a preeminent power. And I think we're in some ways kind of a similar transition as well now, but this is really this time about the gas markets. And particularly in Europe, these changes now are upsetting the status quo. I mean, half a century of a certain status quo where Russia was the primary exporter and the European countries, or the European Union as a whole, was the largest gas importer in the world. Also, in terms of the gas market, well, gas as a commodity itself is now becoming much more liquid, much more readily available, much more easily transportable and tradable. And this is quite a contrast to before, when gas was really a much more localized and much more regional commodity, which carried with that political implications. It meant that it was often kind of doled out by energy monopolists and their affiliated states, and often under the type of, the types of undertones of political influence. So in our discussion with Keith, we'll go a little bit through the different regions and what that means. And I hope you will enjoy the conversation and the discussion, and I will be looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
See, I've already got my well-eared copy of the book here. I know a lot of you, some of you know me. My name's Keith Johnson. I'm the managing editor at Foreign Policy for News. For a number of years, I covered the geopolitics of energy, so a lot of these issues are near and dear to me. You mentioned the regional approach, and I'm going to go through that, and I think that's the best way probably to go through and tackle sort of the issues. But before we even did that, I wanted to start out with the point you were making at the end, which is, the oil market, just given the physical nature of the commodity and the way it's moved around the world, has always been a little bit more fungible. It's been a little bit more of a global market. For a number of years now, people have been talking about the changes in the gas market, and it's going to move from this sort of localized, regional, point-to-point model to a more global market, right? And yet it's evolved in fits and starts, right? And so at the same time, you talk about an LNG cargo going to Poland or an LNG cargo going to Lithuania, but we still have massive pipelines into Europe. We have a new Russian pipeline into Germany. We have the power of Siberia. So it seems like the old and the new are coexisting. So what I wanted to ask you is, are we there yet to sort of this global gas market? If not, how do you see it evolving over the next decade? I mean, is it ever going to look exactly like the oil market?
Well, I'll say this, there's a huge debate about this, of course, but I will say that the gas market is more global today than it has ever been before. And it's how we choose to define it in a way. Some people have already said we are in a global gas market, while others say we're on the cusp. In what I trace and what I view as the drivers of this global gas market are, well, one, the really growing and booming LNG trade, and LNG trade is global. So we do now have really significant global gas trade. In fact, LNG trade has been at its peaks in 2015, 2016. Also, the US shale boom. I mean, that has also been one of the drivers because it has increased supply and increased liquidity. And also, even if we look at traditional gas infrastructure, even those pipelines, I think even they are driving a global gas market because we have now a continuous buildup of interconnections. So interconnections in the gas trade. So we have more traditional pipelines being built. We have more LNG import-export infrastructure being built. And we even have new uses for old pipelines. So we have reverse flows now, which again are interconnecting regional markets and interconnecting those regional markets with other markets and so on. And in terms of, again, some of the proof, I'd say that we are essentially, maybe as close as we can be at this point to a global gas market, is the fact that if we look at the traditional kind of major regional markets like, the Americas, Europe, Asia, those markets are becoming now increasingly interconnected. There's trade between those markets. And also, if we look at gas price differentials, that is typically considered one of the proofs. So gas price differentials between these three different markets have really contracted, and essentially they're just a reflection now of the shipping costs. And also gas pricing. I mean, again, gas pricing is being now driven much more by supply and demand rather than oil-linked pricing. Now, of course, there are still skeptics, and the skeptics will say, but the very nature of gas, of course, kind of prevents it from being a truly global commodity on the same exact level as oil, because gas is more difficult to transport. I mean, even with LNG, it can be transportable, but there are additional costs. I mean, the cost of liquefaction and regasification. So that creates that extra added cost, which is, the nature of gas.
All right. So it's likely to become a global market, if not quite the same as.
And I think we might be there yet already. It's just maybe the question is whether some of the changes we see now are really, structural and permanent, or whether they are perhaps just a result of current markets.
Well, and so this is where I wanted to dive right into the U.S., because you talked a lot about the U.S. in the book and sort of the three drivers you mentioned, the U.S. shale boom, the LNG boom, and the interconnected boom. But it's kind of hard to talk about global gas without talking about the U.S. You and I have gone back and forth on this particular issue because I think we come at it from different points of view. You talk about the U.S. as an energy superpower. Secretary Perry talks about energy dominance. For years, we've had lawmakers talking about using the U.S. energy leverage, whether it's to help partners in Europe, to help NATO allies, to help Japan. The one confusion that always seems to arise, traditional gas suppliers can use sort of a state-driven dirigist model. The U.S. has a bunch of private sector players. So how do you square the circle of having a bunch of private sector exporters working with market forces, and yet have this sort of notion of, hey, we're going to use the energy weapon to help our friends, to reduce Russian dominance? I mean, how does that exactly work in a free market system?
There is a significant difference. There's a significant difference when energy companies are essentially private companies and when they're state-owned companies. And that really does impact how and to what extent you really can kind of play energy diplomacy, wield the energy weapon, and so on. But I would say it doesn't mean that, politics is not significant. I mean, in fact, energy is one of the most politicized industries here in the United States as well. And if we look at some of specific, just some examples. It's interesting that President Donald Trump now in his very first meetings with all the different Asian presidents and leaders, China, South Korea, Japan, India, he brought up American LNG exports. It's also interesting, for example, that if we look at Cheniere's exports just this summer, a private American company right now, the leader of LNG exports, their exports to Poland and Lithuania. In a way we can, think, okay, so what motivated those exports? Was it really about sending a signal to Gazprom and saying, okay, well, we can compete in these markets now, get ready for us. We can be competitive. Maybe it was a signal to Washington. We support your energy diplomacy. Maybe it was, maybe we have a Cheniere representative here, and he can explain it to us. Maybe it was about, maybe we can win some favor with Washington. The same on the other side. You can say, well, for Poland and Lithuania, they've long wanted to diversify away from Russian gas, but they have Norwegian gas. They've been buying Norwegian gas in that region. Did they want to send a signal to Gazprom, or did they maybe want to send a signal to Washington? And likewise, improve relations and build closer ties with the United States, the new U.S. administration, and as well with American industry.
But let me ask you, okay, you mentioned that the price differentials narrowed, right? Because a few years ago, Asian landing prices were, $14, $17 a million BTU. I mean, there's a huge differential with Europe. Those have basically converged now, and it's a very similar price except for shipping. But in theory, still, whether Cheniere or any of the other free market operators, they're going to chase returns with those cargoes, and especially the share of portfolio gas, right? That's just sort of shipping it around to whoever wants to buy it. You talk about the administration wanting to have sort of, to throw America's energy weight around. But if you actually have a lot higher returns, say, in India or South Korea, how do you ensure that cargoes are going to keep going to Lithuania or Poland?
Well, I wouldn't say if that's necessarily the predominant concern. I mean, I think oftentimes companies, they try to capture vast markets. They try to be players, in as many markets as they can, not only in the ones that will offer them the very highest return. Sometimes they're happy to operate even in terms of breaking even as well, especially as they're establishing their trajectory in new markets.
Well, case in point, Exxon, right, which just renegotiated lower its Indian LNG to ensure bigger volumes, right? You mentioned for policymakers, right, because a few years ago, there was one clear policy lever the U.S. had, which would have been to fast-track DOE approval for LNG export terminals. Most of those have been approved and were built or will be built within the next year or so. So what other policy levers are there in Washington to sort of foment this? I mean, is it a trade issue? Would it be sort of export supports? I mean, what can policymakers do to sort of turbocharge that?
Well, it is about legislative decisions, and a lot of those have been already favorable and implemented. It is also a trade issue, and about free trade agreements. Of course, we're probably not going to call them free trade agreements anymore, but we're going to still have trade agreements. And those, again, can be structured to benefit American LNG exports. They're also, for example, one of Trump's kind of early deals with China was to facilitate the sale of American LNG directly to Chinese energy companies, which makes it much easier for American companies to export to China directly.
Right. Okay. No, I want to come back to the China-U.S. nexus when we get to China,
Yeah.
but just one final point on the U.S. role, because, and you alluded to this in the presentation. You have a big section on the book. Europe as a destination for LNG is not a monolithic sort of block. I mean, you mentioned
Yes.
Places like Lithuania, Poland, especially the landlocked areas would love to have more LNG. Most of the terminals are in Western Europe, especially Spain is overloaded with LNG terminals. Can the U.S. do anything? Can Brussels do anything to sort of further fix the infrastructure to make Europe more receptive to LNG? I mean, I know there's been a lot of progress on interconnectors and east-west and north-south pipelines, but I mean, is there anything left in the quiver that policymakers can do to sort of fix that structural imbalance?
I think the ideas are all there, and Europe has been working on this for several decades. I mean, I guess it's about, fully implementing a lot of these projects. So for Europe, it is not just about building additional LNG, import infrastructure. And of course, that import infrastructure is not evenly located. I mean, it is more located in the Iberian Peninsula and the UK. It's having more LNG import infrastructure in, Southeast Europe and Eastern Europe and so on. But it's also building up that internal infrastructure and internal interconnections. Because let's face it, countries that are, don't have coastal access, they cannot access LNG. So unless they have good interconnections with neighboring countries that do, they cannot really benefit from the additional, let's say, inflows of LNG into Europe. It's also about, reverse flows of pipelines. It's also about liberalizing the European energy market and the gas market. And again, a lot of this is underway. And in this area, in this energy sector, I mean, it takes sometimes decades. But I think it's essentially Europe is on the right track. And for them, it's also, I mean, they have other priorities as well about energy efficiency and renewables and reducing their overall dependence on fossil fuels. So it's part of their broader energy strategy of security and diversification.
All right, well, when we're talking diversification in Europe, we're talking about Russia, right? And you have a great section in the book historically with the construction of the pipelines in the 60s, the sort of the Cold War trade that was going on for Russian gas, and which up until recently functioned on a very similar sort of model. And then because of many of the developments that you've talked about as well, the interconnection, a little bit more fungibility in the market, it seems like Russia's energy stranglehold has been weakened a little bit. It's sort of the fingers are off the windpipe. How would you characterize right now Russia's sort of energy relationship with Europe writ large? Is it still an energy weapon? Can they still use it to browbeat people? Or is it more of just a sort of a mutual dependency commercial arm that's important for revenues for the Russian state. How would you characterize it?
I think it's evolving right now. I think, well, for Russia, gas has been traditionally, really since the Cold War, not only a source of revenues, but also a source of influence. Also, in a way, a glue, that it could tie in countries of, the Eastern Bloc and establish closer relations with, the European powers. Today, I think because Russia a bit, overplayed their hand, I mean, in their energy relationship with Europe, especially in the markets where they had a monopoly. There was a backlash against that. And, again, much of Europe's policy has been to diversify. Of course, the levels of dependence are so different in Europe. And of course, that's why some countries in Central and Eastern Europe are very worried about Russian gas, and, others are much less so. But of course, for Russia, this is not a sector, this is not a market they're going to leave easily, and certainly not without a fight. Europe is Gazprom's most important market. And if we look at where the markets are most important, well, Germany is its largest market in Europe, and that's why we see, Nord Stream 1, plans for Nord Stream 2, being pushed very, very aggressively, because this is a market they want to hold on to. Also, Turkey is Russia's second largest European market. Again, we see Turkstream. This is where they want to hold on, hold on to their market as well.
You bring up Germany, and I wanted to get into this a little bit because you've mentioned sort of Europe wants to diversify, or Europe wants to do this, and we speak about Europe as if it were sort of a single block. And it does have a commissioner for energy union, even though it's energy disunion. But just today, I think it was, or yesterday, the German authorities said that the internal EU laws cannot apply to Nord Stream 2. And it's sort of a blow to Brussels' regulatory efforts to kneecap this pipeline. Germany wants to have Nord Stream 2 built, right? Many other countries, especially in the East, don't want to have Nord Stream 2 built. Is that does that give a new lease on life to sort of the old traditional model of point-to-point, long-term contract, country-to-country dependency relationship? I mean, in other words, is that sort of a speed bump on the road to this more global and flexible gas market?
We can view it as a speed bump. What has changed in Europe, though, what's very significant is that the European Commission essentially eliminated what are called destination clauses. So in gas contracts. So previously, essentially, in a gas contract, if, let's say, Russia sold gas to Germany, that meant that gas could not go beyond Germany. It had to stay, let's say, and be only used for German consumption. And this was the case with, most contracts. With that eliminated, it means that that gas could go anywhere. And this increases kind of trade, again, and liquidity and flexibility in the European gas markets. So, let's say worst case scenario, or, the Nord Stream 2 does go ahead, which, I think it may. I mean, I think we may have more insight into this after the German elections as well. So, I'd like to really see Merkel's final decision on this after the election. But, I think it's likely to go ahead. So Germany will become a major gas trading hub of Europe, and I think it will be basically sending that gas, Russian gas, onwards to different parts of Europe. Most European countries trust Germany as a gas trading power. They don't expect that it's going to start to, try to gain political leverage or influence over them if they're buying gas from Germany. Plus, especially now that more countries have their own LNG terminals and they have alternatives, right? On the negative side, I think this will entrench further kind of that gas relationship between Russia and Germany, and the political, let's say, influence that comes with it. And I think we can just say George Schroeder, and we know kind of what that means. So essentially, it will be more of that potentially, which I think is not, the best thing. But again, with Europe having more flexibility and more options, it won't be the worst thing.
You mentioned an entrenchment of the Russian-German gas relationship. Do you worry, because there were a lot of screams of bloody murder from the East, right? Whether it's the Ukraine, the Czechs, Hungarians, Slovaks, Poles, the Baltics, right? With this bypass and another additional volume into Germany. Do you worry that if Nord Stream 2 goes ahead, it's going to further widen the breaches between West and East within the European Union?
You know, there are many differences among the European country states. They have different interests. It's natural. They're always, I think, you know, negotiating, disagreeing, agreeing, trying to find common ground. And I'd say, well, you know, and Russia is always trying to exploit those differences and disagreements. So I wouldn't maybe place it as, you know, the main cause of, you know, differences, or I wouldn't pinpoint it as the cause of a potential future, you know, gulf between Eastern and Western countries, but it is a concern. I mean, it is, the European Union is discussing, you know, an energy union and common energy goals, common energy market, joint negotiation for gas contracts. So, you know, this is not a step in that direction, it's kind of the step in the opposite direction.
In terms of Europe, because we're talking about this big pipeline to Germany, we're talking about the Turk Stream pipeline to Turkey, the number 1 and number 2 customers for Gazprom's exports. And we're sort of, you're using here a prism, sort of a commercial prism. Europe's an important market. These are 2 important buyers. There's one country that's getting cut out, whether you go north through the Baltic or go down through the Black Sea. I wondered if you could talk just a little bit from Gazprom's point of view, from the Kremlin's point of view, how important are sort of non-commercial considerations? In other words, the long-term desire to cut out Ukraine as a transit state, how important is that in sort of the decisions that make up, you know, Russia's gas policy?
You know, this, it can be understood really 2 ways. So first, I mean, there's certainly an effort to cut out Ukraine from the gas transit business. Certainly this decision is also influenced politically because, you know, Ukraine has been moving away from Russia. But this is not a new policy of the Russian industry, and this is not a new policy of Putin. In fact, really since the 2000s, and this is really the subject of my first book, Russia has tried to eliminate transit states in the energy business as much as they could. Transit states in terms of oil flows, they try to increasingly build up their own terminals, their own ports. And you know, that makes sense commercially, of course. I mean, it makes sense to use your own territory and give business to your own ports and your own terminals. You know, in energy trade, it's also about securing those export routes because, again, energy export is crucially important for Russia. Energy exports make up, you know, 50% of Russia's budget. But what I found in my research and my first book, I found that really, essentially, you know, Gazprom or, you know, other Russian energy players make those decisions about when, essentially, to eliminate a transit state. It's when they have kind of political, you know, a political fallout with that country. So, you know, I think it really is you know, both factors, the kind of commercial and political considerations are driving that. But for Ukraine, you know, yesterday I was, the Vice Prime Minister was here in DC from Ukraine, and she said that Ukraine has now gone 550 days without importing gas from the Russian Federation directly.
For its own consumption, right?
For its own consumption. For its own consumption. I mean, it still means that Ukraine is consuming Russian gas. It's just it's getting that same Russian gas now through reverse flow from European countries. But it no longer has that, you know, complicated, let's say, relationship with Russia and the political undertones that go with it. And I think while being cut out of the gas transit business for Ukraine will be tough economically in the short to medium term, you know, of course it will you know, be a cut on their revenues. I think longer term, actually, it might be the best thing for the country at the end of the day, because along with that gas transit goes a lot of corruption, and it really prevents the country from modernizing and developing its economy, and developing, frankly, other sectors of its economy, and developing its own natural gas production. I mean, Ukraine can be fully self-sufficient with its own natural gas production, but just because it's been kind of in this web of Russian gas transit, and many people profited from it. That was not the focus of the country for the last 25 years.
Right. Well, the war didn't help either. So. We've talked a lot about the U.S. role as an additional source of diversification for Europe, but every so often, bubbling to the surface are alternative suppliers on Europe's periphery. And I wondered if you could just take a minute, because sometimes you hear overheated expectations. For instance, the role of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's been big gas finds off of Israel. Cyprus periodically gets excited. There's some promising finds, right north of Egypt. But there's two schools of thought, right? One school says they're relatively small volumes and there's a lot of need in the region for gas anyway. The other school of thought says, hey, this is a relatively close for Southeastern Europe in particular. Is the Eastern Med going to shape up as an alternative source of supply for Europe anytime soon?
Maybe I'm more among the skeptics on that one, especially in the near term. So the gas finds in Israel and Cyprus and Egypt, they are significant, and they are geographically, in good proximity to Europe. But if, for example, we look at, in the major finds in Israel, Leviathan and Tamar, there are many issues in place there, because first, Israel has put its own restrictions domestically. Basically, 50% of that gas has to be used for domestic purposes. It cannot be exported. So that's one. Second, there's need in the region, in Israel's own proximity. And actually, Israel has been playing its own very good, gas diplomacy strategy, kind of sending gas to its neighbors and thus improving relations. If we look at Egypt's finds, again, their demands, their domestic demands are tremendous, and Egypt is now importing gas from Israel. So it's, at least for the near term, it's unlikely, also because of lack of existing infrastructure, that this gas will go to Europe. Maybe the most likely scenario would be that Israel would use Egypt's LNG terminal to export gas to Europe. But again, I think first that gas will find a market locally.
Well, okay, so if it doesn't serve as an additional source of supply for Europe, and you just alluded to sort of Israeli-Egypt gas trade, can there be pipelines for peace, right, so to speak? Can the regional development there sort of salve over a lot of the irritants? We've seen progress in the Israeli-Turkish relationship, in part because of hopes for greater energy. 5 years ago, Egypt was shipping gas to Israel. Now it goes the other way.
Yes.
There were hopes that the need to sort out sort of exploration blocks could pave the way for reunification in Cyprus. Is energy going to be the key to more peaceful relations, or are peaceful relations the prerequisite for energy development there?
Well, the chicken or the egg,
right,
I don't know.
Yeah.
What's the answer to that?
Right.
Really difficult to say. Really difficult to say. At least at the time period, I don't see. I think those gas finds and that gas trade, will temper, or ease relations somewhat. But I don't think this will be the deciding factor to solve, the problems of the Middle East, which
go way back.
Yes.
So Azerbaijan then could be.
Yes.
If we expand the scope just a little bit, maybe not the Eastern Med, but we've got the Caucasus, we've got big projects. It's been decades in the works. Is that a way then to ensure a steady supply of non-Russian gas coming into Southern Europe, or is that going to be just on the margins?
Well, first of all, this is a very important project, and Europe has been, trying to get this going for decades. So, and now it's, finally, on the horizon, or sooner than a horizon. It's in progress. And this will be really the first time that Azeri gas, Caspian gas, will go to Europe by pipeline. So it's an alternative pipeline route. Again, very important for diversification purposes, because when you think about energy security and diversification, it's also kind of a diversification of different methods, right? So it's about having pipelines, but pipelines coming from different regions and different suppliers. It's also about having LNG. It's also about maybe having your own domestic production of various energy sources. So from that angle, the Azeri gas is very significant. It's already going to Georgia, so it already diversified Georgia away from Russian gas. And that was historic as well. It will go to Turkey next year, and then by 2020 to, the plan is for Italy, Greece, Albania, Southeast Europe, which is again a market where Gazprom has a very strong position, and that's a market they would like to hold on to. And that's why, again, the Turk Stream project is not just about Turkey, because then it's also about maintaining, going further then into Southeast Europe and maintaining those markets.
Right. Okay, I wanted to shift to the east because, and you make a great point about this in the book, that Europe may have a lot of the biggest short-term changes geopolitically, but the real wild card for global gas markets is in Asia, specifically China and India. But I wanted to start with China because it has this nexus with Russia. I mean, for at least a decade, maybe more, Russia and China have been trying to match what seemed like a match made in heaven: big energy supplier, big energy consumer. Finally, kind of sort of consummated with the Power of Siberia pipeline, but hasn't quite got there yet. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see China's demand for gas specifically going forward? Is it going to be more reliant on imports, or is it going to be able to meet a lot of that from domestic production, conventional, shale, whatever?
Well, I think China has probably one of the most carefully thought out energy strategies, and really one that's very forward-looking. They're essentially considering every element of energy security, and it is about diversification of their suppliers and the various routes and methods. So again, they already receive gas by pipeline from Myanmar, from Central Asia. They're building pipeline, the Power of Siberia pipeline. I mean, I think this one, it will go ahead. It is in progress. So they will get piped gas from Russia. They're also very aggressive on LNG imports, again, from a variety of sources. I mean, American LNG went to China last year, but they also have their traditional suppliers, Qatar and Australia and other countries from that region. They are also very focused about pursuing their own domestic production in conventional gas and also shale gas. I mean, in fact, China is only one of the 4 countries in the world that has successfully fracked and received resources from shale. I mean, it's the United States, Canada, China, and Argentina, although they are doing tight oil from shale. Yeah, for now, of course, the amounts are minuscule. I mean, they're still tiny. And considering how much China has invested in this project, they've invested a tremendous amount. I mean, the results really, we have to say, are disappointing. But it doesn't mean that they'll stop. I mean, they're fully committed to this project. I would describe it as become almost a political project for them. Sooner or later, they will deliver that success. For now, maybe it looks, it will be more later, but it will happen.
Okay. Because this is what I wanted to ask. 5 years ago, when China had 10% growth rates every year, and it had a push to sort of diversify away from dirty coal, it seemed like the sky was the limit. And you could look at, Chinese gas demand projections, and they were off the charts. Then we had the great slowdown, right? The rebalancing, shift away from heavy industries. You got real growth rates probably closer to 5%. Is there a concern that after everybody really bet the farm, whether it was the Australians, whether it was Qataris, whether it was the US, in terms of ramping up the gas supply infrastructure, that the one big customer everyone was banking on is not going to need quite so much gas? Or do you think it's going to rebound?
Frankly, I think, China is the largest energy consumer in the world. And its energy needs are only going to grow, and its gas needs are only going to grow, especially as it seeks to diversify away from coal, because really pollution is becoming a social and a political issue in China. So as we were discussing, I mean, I think China's next revolution could be over, pollution or environmental concerns. So I think where, some of this thinking, I mean, people expected it just to grow faster. They expected that demand to grow faster, and this growth, at least now, has been somewhat tempered in comparison to previous expectations. But it doesn't mean that it's not huge.
So if you, I mean, you mentioned the diversity of suppliers that are already there for China. We've got Power of Siberia, possibly another Siberian pipeline through Altai. You've also got U.S. LNG, right? Who is going to be, if anybody, who is going to be the main supplier for Chinese gas in the future? I mean, is that a role that the U.S. could actually play, realistically, to push Russia out as sort of the main energy supplier?
Well, I think many people would like to be in that position. And actually, Russia would like to sell more LNG to China. It's banking on that. I mean, seeing a slowdown in Europe, Russia's energy strategy to 2035 that was just released 2 years ago really says, okay, well, now we're going to focus on Asia, China first. But while many people would like to be that primary supplier, frankly, no one will be China's primary supplier. And that comes from really China's very careful modeling of their energy strategy. They don't want to be dependent on the key or the main supplier. They want to have a lot of different suppliers, and in a way, they're very much, they're well managing their kind of power of demand. They know they have a huge market, and they negotiate very aggressively to get the best terms. And all the suppliers essentially will be just, they will just contribute one slice of the pie for China.
The U.S. had one direct LNG shipment to China already. Do you envision, assuming a little bit more infrastructure, more traffic through the Panamax, do you envision a day where U.S. energy trade with China could act as sort of a guarantor of more amicable ties between the two countries? I mean, to establish sort of a trade relationship in a fundamental needed way that could sort of act as a safety valve for the tensions that otherwise keep popping up in the relationship?
U.S.-China relations. I mean, I do think it's a positive factor, and I do think that for the United States, having LNG exports and having them for China is one of the tools that they can use to kind of improve that relation and to have more influence in that relationship. And also, China doesn't want to solely depend on, again, Russian gas, either in piped form or LNG. And playing these essentially two powers as well is beneficial for the country.
Historically, for Asian LNG, Japan and South Korea have been the big markets. Japan, in recent years, with the nuclear outage, particular fill-up in terms of LNG demand. Then it went on a coal push. How do you see those two markets evolving? Historically been the anchor for Asian gas, in particular LNG. Everyone's all excited about China because of the huge growth numbers. But as a baseline, how do you see Northeast Asia evolving?
Well, Japan and South Korea, they've been the key LNG importers, for decades. The largest LNG importers, at least right now. And this will continue to be the case, really, for them because, in a way, I mean, they're called LNG islands. They don't have the ability to import gas by pipeline. Russia has always, of course, brought up the subject that they could build a pipeline to, South Korea or Japan, but there are many issues with that. I mean, when it comes to South Korea, going through North Korea, I mean, that would be certainly an issue. And with Japan, of course, the historical, distrust and tensions between the two countries, especially over the Sakhalin Islands and so on. So I don't think that's in the cards. And especially now that we see the tendency of more LNG trade, I mean, really the boost of LNG trade, and these countries having more options from different suppliers, kind of an underwater pipeline, that would be a very, very expensive project. It would really have to have also political interest from South Korea and Japan, and I'm, not sure. I mean, while it keeps, the countries keep kind of discussing it again and bringing it up, I'm not quite sure this is something in the cards for us in the foreseeable future.
Well, just to follow up on one thing, because a few years ago, a lot of people talked about this notion of a Korean sort of pipeline, a spinal column pipeline, right? That could act as a unifying force. Russia, perfectly eager to be able to get at the isolated South Korean market. There was a lot of fear over the last decade in South Korea about any energy dependency. You now have a sunshine policy in South Korea. So despite the recent troubles in North Korea, is that something you could even envision as a hypothetical down the road, as some sort of natural gas pipeline that could help physically spur reunification on the peninsula?
I'll leave that for, the South Korea, North Korean experts. This
Okay.
one, I think this one is a tough one. I don't see it in the near term, and again, especially to seeing where gas markets are going. I mean, at least right now, LNG is increasingly cheap. It's increasingly abundant. There are new suppliers. There are many new producers.
Even Russian LNG could come down.
Yes, even Russian LNG, but even, let's see what happens with the Chinese production at some point, conventional production and so on.
Okay.
So,
You mentioned the sort of the buyer's power that China has. Huge market, lots of different options, can play off suppliers. Kind of an opposite situation prevails in India, right? So the other big Asian market, and yet historically they've been perceived as not having any real purchasing power. They've been takers, not makers. They've squeezed a little bit more out of Exxon here recently. Is LNG and gas more broadly, is that going to be the salvation for India, which has a huge, huge energy and pollution headache on its hands? I mean, is LNG going to ride to the rescue there?
It's interesting that we talk so much about, when we talk about, Asian gas demand, we focus so much about China, and really India doesn't get as much attention, even though, the size, the economic growth really positions the country as, a major, energy consumer, and frankly, gas is, on their demand list, particularly because of the environmental problems that they're already facing from coal, that again are becoming a social issue. But the difference between India and China, where I'd say, China has, crafted such a careful policy and put all the dots in place for them, different suppliers, different routes. India really hasn't done that. I mean, in part of some of it has to do with geography, of course, as well. But, India doesn't have any pipelines delivering gas to the country. Overall, India's internal gas infrastructure is, still, far from where it should be. In fact, some regions of India don't have any gas pipelines. So let's say even if you were to import that gas from somewhere, how would you distribute it across the country, and how would you distribute it to industrial centers and so on? Now, there are plans for pipelines. So the TAPI pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan, through Pakistan to India. Now, hearing the geography, we can already note some of the potential problems, right? Especially going through Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan said that they'll just post troops all along the pipeline, just standing there and guarding the pipeline. Now, if we also look at Turkmenistan itself, there are lots of people who want that Turkmen gas now. China wants Turkmen gas. They've already, paid the money up front, and they've already built that pipeline long time ago, in the 2000s. There's Europe. The Europeans want, that Turkmen gas to potentially connect from under the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, and through Azerbaijan through the southern corridor into Southeast Europe. So whether there will be enough gas from Turkmenistan for all of these players, that's a big question. We also don't have very accurate accounts of how much gas Turkmenistan really has. Turkmen government estimates of the gas are very different from the international estimates. I mean, they're tenfold larger according to the Turkish government. We don't know really exactly how large these gas estimates are.
So from the point of view of India, if we leave aside TAPI, which seems to have a number of obstacles, but if India were to focus on LNG, you've got the lack of internal pipelines, right? You also have a policy that so far has been leaning a little bit more towards coal. There's some domestic coal. The 5-year plans called for an awful lot of coal-fired power plants. Is India, just politically, and this sort of strays just a wee bit away from the gas point of view, but China went down a coal-heavy development route, paid the price in terms of pollution. Where do you see India on that same sort of pathway?
I think there was this great enthusiasm over coal, and that will continue to be a big, part of India's mix. But they are waking up to the need to have, cleaner energy, and gas would be part of that mix. And India is looking. I mean, India does get LNG imports. It's now, I believe, well, maybe the fifth largest, somewhere there, LNG importer in the world. Already, even though the amounts are small, relatively, still. So, Qatar, Australia, I mean, Russia, this is one area, again, where Russia, wants to see a greater market, and they're moving ahead with joint projects with India, and India investing in Novatek's, LNG terminal projects. So, I mean, for now, before the pipelines are built, I mean, LNG will be essentially India's way to access gas.
Okay. Just to close the circle, before I throw it open, because hopefully we have time for a few questions from the audience. Just to close the circle, you'd mentioned some of the overland pipe routes, the TAPI. There's some overland pipe routes through Baluchistan as well. Iran as a wild card in future gas markets. There's a lot of enthusiasm both about pipelines out of Iran and about Iran finally, after 25 years, getting on the LNG bandwagon and exporting. There's also the sanctions problem, the investment problems in South Pars. How do you see Iran evolving as an export player, not just in regional but in global gas markets?
Well, when it comes to the region, actually, and when we look at Europe, I think Iran could be, more longer term, really a major potential source of diversification from Europe because of, geographically, and also because of just the resources that Iran has. I mean, according to different estimates, some people estimate even that, Iran might have more gas reserves than Russia even. I mean, there's competing estimates on that. I mean, it has, half of the largest gas field in the world, the South Pars, with, North Pars on the other side. So, but for now, I mean, of course, because of the sanctions, because of the lack of pipeline export infrastructure, because of, right now, over the last, since 2016, there's been interest, especially from European investors, to try to get this moving. But LNG exports will probably be more likely in the near term because, again, that infrastructure is easier to build than land pipeline infrastructure. Another option is that Iran could build just a short pipeline to Oman and then use Oman's LNG export infrastructure. So I think that, for me, I see Iran's supplies as more likely than the East Med. Or maybe more significant just because of the size of those reserves. But again, this is something we have to watch, and it's not here today. So this might be a question of, a decade or so, or more.
Well, and especially with the capital constraints, right? I mean,
yes.
if the sanctions remain on there, I mean,
yes.
You mentioned the European firms who've been eager to go back in,
yes.
French energy firms, Italians. A lot of people very gun shy due to the web of current restrictions. I mean, that alone could push back development a decade
yes.
or more, right?
Yes. And we also don't know how relations are going to evolve between this administration and Iran. And I think people are also, watching to see, what will be, Trump administration steps vis-a-vis Iran. And that will also influence decision making in terms of investment.
Fantastic. Hopefully we've got a mic here somewhere in the room. So if anyone has any questions, we got a gentleman here in the back and then here in the second row. For Dr. Grigas.
Thank you. Thank you for your discussion and presentation. Steve Herman from Energy Capital Partners. It occurs to me that the commercial terms for these new proposed pipelines from Russia, whether they're to Germany or Turkey, that the commercial terms will have a big impact on the market. Are they take or pay contracts? Can the gas be resold? Who is taking the financial risk of the pipeline? Who's paying the capital cost of the pipeline? Those types of issues will, in my opinion, have a significant impact on the gas markets. the competitive gas markets. So could you speak to that if you're into that detail?
Well, I think we have already seen the changes in the gas markets and greater competition and greater trade in gas driven from the United States change the way gas business is done in Europe. I mean, so it already has had an impact in Europe and globally. And I mean, okay, destination clauses were eliminated, by the European Commission, but the Gazprom's and increasing flexibility with having shorter term contracts or doing more spot trade than before. Also being more flexible in terms of pricing. I mean, Europe long wanted to have more hub-based pricing rather than gas pricing linked on oil contracts. So a lot of this is already happening. So I think one way or another, I think regardless, of Nord Stream 2 or Turk Stream, all of these issues are already kind of in negotiations versus they were not before. I mean, these were not issues Gazprom negotiated with in the past, and now they are. And this is really a reflection of the changed markets. And this is, again, where America's role is so important, because now it's becoming a driver of gas trade, right? An important player in global gas trade. And thus American kind of terms of ways of doing business are also now becoming more widespread and more accepted. And other players pretty much have to, if they want to be competitive, they have to be more open and more flexible to those terms. Or those new ways, let's say, of doing business in the gas sector.
Great, thanks. So we had a question here in the second row.
Rich Koslerich from George Mason University and former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. Geopolitics of gas for the U.S. started home. And my question is, you're talking about 2.5 years from now that the U.S. becomes the third largest gas exporter in the world. Is our infrastructure up to supporting that much export? And second, from the point of view, traditionally we have supported pipelines as a way of increasing energy security in Europe. If we become a gas exporter, why would we want to support pipelines carrying gas to markets for our own producers?
This is a good question, and it's interesting how much, it's a reflection of how much has changed, because the United States has been one of, let's say, the chief advocates of the Southern Gas Corridor, gas that would come into Europe and diversify away from Russian gas. I mean, frankly, the United States was almost more interested in this project than the large European countries. And now the United States has, let's say, a potential alternative. They have their own LNG. I don't, for me, I view it more, in fact, that, and I'd say now maybe there's some questions in Europe, well, maybe the United States is only pursuing its own economic interests here. But in fact, there's been great continuity in America's kind of vision in terms of energy diversification. And I don't view this as some sort of now new, obviously, shift in terms of American, energy interest or economic interest and so on. And the United States has been kind of very consistent on the need for Europe to diversify by pipeline and by LNG. And in fact, the U.S., it was the U.S. agencies that funded the initial studies, the very early studies of, for the, let's say, Lithuanian LNG terminal and so on. And I'm trying to think the first part of your question. Well, is the infrastructure ready? The U.S. infrastructure, exactly. Well, they're working on it, right? I think the plans, the plans are in place. There are always issues about, more, again, domestic interconnectivity in gas pipelines, connecting the gas-producing regions to the, export terminals and the regions that export, and also across the United States. So more could be done on that. I think the plans at least kind of, seem to point in the right direction. And of course, as you say, 2.5 years still, energy markets are volatile. I mean, possibly as volatile as the financial markets or international relations. So, things could happen. We could have some upsets. We could have some, unexpected developments. One that I think people debate is, let's say energy prices were to rise significantly. Would the United States still be, let's say, as interested in exports if that's going to hurt American domestic industry, or would they prefer to keep the energy resources at home to make American industry more competitive and so on? So there are debates like this, again, which we'll see how the current administration will handle it, because again, the plan is America first, and American, or the energy plan is even the America First energy plan.
Well, actually, if I could just follow up on that, because you made a reference to it in the book, that this debate that sort of prevailed 13, 14, 15 over should we export the natural gas boom or should we keep it at home? And when you see the importance of cheap energy for the manufacturing boom, especially in the Gulf Coast and things like that, you mentioned that the debate has sort of been settled for now, but could be sort of a sleeping dragon. If you have an American first economic policy, if you have a manufacturing heavy economic policy, right, doesn't that sort of carry the seeds of a conflict between energy dominance on the one hand and keep the gas here to fuel sort of a manufacturing renaissance? I mean, it doesn't seem the debate's over yet.
Well, I think the seed is there for those potential tensions. For me, the answer is obvious. The United States, I think, has now, a unique advantage, a unique first mover advantage. Its shale revolution has not been replicated anywhere, and it's unlikely to be replicated in the near to medium term by any other country. Interest in terms of LNG exports, as I said, they coincide with America's long-standing interests in terms of European energy security, in terms of reining in Russia. So, for me, this is clear. The path, but of course, again, there's that seed, and it doesn't mean that debate won't be raised again.
Right. Absolutely. We got a question here in the front row, and then the third row there.
Warren Wilczewski from the Energy Information Administration. It's an excellent discussion and could probably carry on until the evening hours, but I have a more focused question about Europe again, which is, it's kind of an interesting situation that's going on right now. So Total's Poyan, the CEO of Total, has recently come out against Chinese investment in Greece, right? The Chinese are buying up ports and energy assets, and he finds that unappealing because it creates kind of an island for China to then influence the rest of Europe. But I have yet to hear from Total about Russia's ownership of, for example, storage facilities at Baumgarten, or energy transport assets or utilities throughout Europe, right? And how much leverage that provides Russian companies on both the delivery and also on the receipt. So is there maybe a schizophrenic approach for Europe vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis, let's say, China? Or is there some kind of a uniform policy that Europe could maybe discover or implement that might provide them with some kind of a security buffer against any kind of international influence in their energy markets? And maybe it's not just Russia, it's, Qataris, for example, own receipt terminals, and other countries also have a foothold there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Warren. And also, I have to say, Warren helped me quite a bit with the book, giving me his insights and suggestions, and also, helping with finding the right data that I needed at the Energy Information Agency. So thank you. You have a very good question. I mean, I'm hoping maybe you have the solution of this potential. Maybe you've thought about it. The solution, the potential buffer Europe could have from external influences. So if you do, I think share it with us. I'm not sure I can come up with one right now. I think, but I didn't get on, you raised an important area, which actually I detail quite a bit in my book. I mean, I really detailed the kind of the 2000s and what I call, Gazprom's heyday in Europe, when essentially it wasn't just, a powerful supplier. It was also Gazprom and other Russian energy interests were, major investors, acquiring lots of energy assets, downstream, and gas storage, and so on. So, it's interesting, how and that really did strengthen their position in the European markets. And I think it also kind of still left them some sway today, right, over the gas decisions being made in Europe. So it's interesting how, some European countries, Germany, France, you can say, Italy, even UK, you can say to some extent, they've been buying kind of Russian and Soviet gas for half a century now. They seem to have kind of
they know how it works.
They
right?
know how it works. They've gotten used to the relationship in a way. Sometimes gotten used to it for the wrong reasons, maybe, I don't know. And changes, even now these discussions I find surprising in Europe. Oh, well, America wants to export gas to Europe for its own economic interests. Well, I mean, yes, but again, if you look at American, as I said, policies, consistent policies towards European energy security, they've been very consistent. It's not like this has been a turnaround yesterday out of economic interests. Similarly, of course, China now is a new player, and again, China, as I mentioned, they're working hard across every layer to ensure their energy security. Really, because that's going to be also the driver of their economic growth. They have to have access to energy, and again, they have to now have access to cleaner energy because, those smog days, I think sooner or later there will be.
Lose the mandate of heaven if you have too many smog days.
Yes.
We've got a little bit of time. We've got 2 questions left here. I got third row, and then I've got a lady there in the back row.
I'll try to be quick.
Yeah, because we're going to run out of time here.
Thank you. Quick question. Beach Gray, open source media analytics at Novota Corporation. Thank you for a great talk. I thought it was really interesting that you sort of carved up the world geographically, but one region we didn't get to is the Arctic, which is really interesting because Russia has a big stake there. They are developing projects there. And unlike the Antarctic that's already carved up, the Arctic, no one really knows who owns it. It's ocean, it's frozen water. So, I'm just wondering, what do you see as the future? Is it going to be carved up by, the UK and the US and the Nordic countries and Russia, or are people just going to sort of back off Russia?
Well, Russia already planted their flag there, right? So,
literally.
literally. So I wonder what that means. But I do discuss this in the book. This is, I think, really one of the future areas, and one area where Russia is looking at, with a lot of, let's say, focus and determination. It's, a lot of the resources lie there. And it's about that fight for those future resources, and also about shipping routes. Mm-hmm. Because again, if global gas trade moves more towards LNG, LNG shipping, those routes become also more important. So just briefly.
Fantastic. I was going to ask you, in fact, on that point, whether it's more important, do you think, whether it's Northwest Passage or the Northern Sea Route, whether the opening of the Arctic is more important as a source of potential production or of transport?
I think they're both important, and we also have to see how things develop, right? In terms of also the production and the cost of the production, and the yields there.
Prohibitive right now.
Yes, but Russia is still pursuing them. The U.S. has essentially put a pause on that.
Right.
But
okay.
I think Russia sees its future there, or one of its futures there.
Fantastic.
So
final question there in the back. Yeah. We've got a mic coming your way there.
I'm wondering if you might comment about the possibilities of competition within Russia for export. There have been reports about Rosneft challenging Gazprom and other players, and how this might play out within and within domestically within Russian export politics, and then for Europe and Asia.
Yes. This is an excellent question, and of course this is kind of the big question mark for Russia's gas sector going forward. I do discuss this in the book. Gazprom has not managed essentially to send LNG. Novatek has, a major competitor. Novatek is very, very aggressive in its LNG policy. Its president recently said that they, not Gazprom, will position Russia as maybe even, I don't know, the largest LNG exporter in the world, or something like that. something quite dramatic. Certainly boosting LNG exports is overall part of Russia's plan. I mean, Rosneft is another player, and this is also not just for LNG exports, but also for potentially pipeline exports, that other players will now have access to pipelines and be able to sell gas to external markets. Overall, I would say, I mean, Gazprom, this is not its, while it's the golden age of gas, it's not the golden age of Gazprom, really. It's seeing competition, in the international market. It's seeing competition domestically. It also has to bear kind of the brunt of a lot of Russia's domestic gas policies. I mean, essentially, it has to subsidize Russia's domestic gas consumption because it, supplies the consumers, the households of Russia at very, essentially, almost for free. So, they have to pay for it. So this is kind of, Gazprom is a company to watch to see how it, and that kind of competition between other players, other players in the Russian gas sector.
Fantastic. Well, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Grigas. Thank you to the Atlantic Council. This is the book. You can grab some copies out there. Highly recommended if you're interested in anything to do with the new geopolitics of gas. So thank you very much.
Thank you.